Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to In the City. Each week we unpack a story that's crucial to the world's financial capitals. I'm Allegra Stratton.
And I'm Francine Lacqua.
Now, the government's spending review is just around the corner. Next week, we're going to get a clearer picture of how funding will be allocated across departments for the next 3 years. Can you believe it? There's growing speculation that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, will make a significant push on infrastructure, a signal perhaps of shifting priorities.
Welcome to the City of London.
The City of
London.
The next station is Bank. Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
The financial heart of the country.
The City.
The City.
Welcome to In the City.
Stand clear of the doors, please.
So, Allegra, in this episode, we're stepping back to look at the bigger picture. Could this spending review mark a real turning point? Might it lay the groundwork for lasting resilience rather than just offering short-term relief? Well, to discuss all of this, we're joined by Sam Richards, the chief executive of the think tank Britain Remade and former special advisor at number 10 Downing Street. Sam, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Today, Wednesday, when we're recording this podcast, Rachel Reeves says the spending review will be focused on the priorities of working people. What does that look like?
I think that Britain has, at its heart, a fundamental problem with growth. And what sits underneath that has been our failure to build the new sources of energy, the new homes, and the new transport links that we need. So a focus on the priorities of working people has to be unlocking those, building those key bits of infrastructure, bringing down the cost of housing. London has the most expensive housing in the world, bringing down the cost of energy from the highest industrial energy prices in the world, and making it easier to see friends and family. So hopefully we're going to see some of that with this new focus on building new infrastructure that we see, not just in the spending review, but also in the government's planning bill.
We're talking a second about how you turn a great big bazooka of cash, to use a Boris Johnson phrase that I always think does the job very nicely. How you turn these many billions that her team are briefing into, as Fran says, that kind of experience for people. So we'll talk about that later, because I think that is tough and it's not quick. But before we do, just in terms of the diagnosis of the problem, because you work in this all the time, Sam, with Britain Remade, is, if you look at the energy transition and so on, we've got such a grid problem, we've got such an infrastructure problem that we have to clear away so many of those planning hurdles. Clearly the government's talking about doing that lots and lots in a separate piece of legislation. What's your sense, even when they turn on the taps for this infrastructure, that it's going to work?
So it's worth stepping back and remembering just how bad the problem is. We are currently building the world's most expensive railway line with HS2. We are currently building the world's most expensive nuclear power plant. Indeed, the most expensive nuclear power plant ever constructed in the history of the human race. The planning application for the Lower Thames crossing cost £250 million. That is more than it cost Norway to build the world's longest tunnel. Now, what is the reason for all of this? Well, if you take the example of HS2, it's in no small part down to the fact that we're spending £121 million on a bat tunnel to protect 300 Bechstein bats that live in a nearby wood to where the line goes through, not actually the wood that the line goes through. If you take the example of HS2, it's the fact that EDF have been wrangling with regulators for 8 years about installing this fish disco. This is an underwater acoustic deterrent to stop the fish from swimming into the exhaust pipes of the plant. So the question is then, if the government, as you put it, fires this big bazooka of cash, is it just going to go into these world record expensive projects and we're not actually going to see any output? And that's where what they're doing with the planning bill to streamline some of the environmental rules and regulations to make it harder to sue the government. The majority of infrastructure projects currently end up in the courts, and to reduce the costs of building. That's why that is so critical.
Just explain for us how you would sort of square the circle if you're the Labour government, because in The Guardian today, they've got people criticising them for the effect that their planning bill will have on nature.
So it's worth bearing in mind that as we're making it incredibly expensive to build the homes and the railway lines and the roads and the energy that we need, we're also failing to protect nature under the current regime. So all of our key biodiversity indicators, from farmland birds to insect life, are in decline. Now, why is that? How have we arrived at the worst of both worlds, a system that both fails to protect nature and also stops us building? Partly it's the way that we protect our sites. So rather than having a strategic approach where we go, look, across the country, this is what we want to happen with our various species, we do it this site-by-site, piecemeal approach.
The next question is, when we're looking ahead to next week, and you've got Rachel Reeves already in a speech on Wednesday next week and saying, it's going to be big and meaningful. And Fran, I'm reminded of the interview in this podcast studio we did with Jim O'Neill, where he was defending Rachel Reeves through some of her difficult times and saying, just wait for this big infrastructure moment. So it's really a significant moment for Rachel Reeves and her allies. But I suppose the question is it these exorbitant, expensive protections of nature that are the significant thing, or is it a bundle of things?
So there's a range of factors here. If you look at something like building a new offshore wind farm, right, it takes 2 years at most to physically build an offshore wind farm. At the moment, it takes up to 13 years to get one up and running. That 11-year gap is in grid connections and planning. About half of it is grid connection, and the planning chunk, a big chunk of it is the compiling of environmental impact assessments that stretch to tens of thousands of pages. Switching examples here, but a new railway line, I should rather say reopening an existing railway line, 3.3 miles of track, right, between Bristol and Portishead. The environmental impact assessment for that, well, the overall planning document was 80,000 pages. So the challenge that we have with investment in this country is that it is actually incredibly hard for private capital and indeed for government to actually invest when there are such barriers on building. And actually, this is a problem that Joe Biden had with IRA, in that it was getting the money out the door because of the permitting issues in America. It comes back to the problem of it's all very well government signing the checks, but if it's impossible to actually build the wind farms, the factories for the new electric cars, if you can't actually physically build the things because of the planning rules, and in particular the environmental rules, the environmental permitting, then you're not going to get the growth.
Is Rachel Reeves, when she announces this money next week, do you believe that there's the parallel supply-side reforms on planning liberalisation? Obviously, it's very, very high profile that they're pushing through this legislation through Parliament, and they are being criticised for all the reasons we've just discussed around being too cavalier with nature. But do you think she's got the balance right?
So the government's planning bill has lots of steps in the right direction. Consultation adds years to the process, and they are scrapping, in a genuinely significant move, they are removing pre-application consultation for big infrastructure projects. So that's a couple of years that we've gone from that long timeline that I set out earlier. That's important. They are also, as I've said, making it harder to sue the government. It is the case at the moment that the majority of our infrastructure projects end up bogged down in the courts, and they are reducing the number of opportunities that people will have to sue the government. It will still be the case, though, that your costs will be capped if you sue the government under environmental grounds. A guy who the Prime Minister himself has highlighted, who has brought judicial reviews against pretty much every single road project that the government has sought to build, and that will likely still continue. And then the big question, as I say, is around this, whether they're going far enough to change the way that we do environmental protections. They are looking to bring in this new system that is a move to a strategic approach, and that is to be welcomed. But the problem with the way that they're doing it is it's not a wholesale change to a new system. It's rather instead, on top of all of the existing planning rules and the Town and Country Planning Act and habitats regulations, they're adding another layer on top that they hope will kind of bypass that current system. And while there's some evidence that will work for housing, I'm less confident that that will work for other infrastructure projects. So, I think that there is a risk
And that brings us back to where we started with your question, Fran, around, she's talking today about, working people and this money's going to change working people's lives. Well, it might do, but in 10 years' time.
We also don't know how much money. How much money does she need to make a material difference, right? Before we even count on where she spends it, there's a spending review. Like, how much money does she have to play with? I know there's this tussle within government about saying, well, it's the accountants that are setting policy and she wants to spend. But we're kind of beholden to investors, global investors.
As I say, when it comes to Britain's infrastructure, it really is a question of making sure we get much more bang for our buck. The nuclear power stations that we built in the 80s and 90s were half the price of Hinkley. The ones that we built in the 50s and 60s were a quarter of the price. There is nothing inherent in the technology that means that it has to be as eye-wateringly expensive.
You started the podcast, Sam, with these sort of really inglorious titles, like we're the slowest, we're the worst, it's the most expensive. How did Britain get here? Like, how did we get so slow?
Yeah, I mean, it's been the steady accretion of regulation in a range of sectors, particularly in environmental rules, some of which come from domestic law, some of which come from the EU, but it's also the case that there are more rules on health and safety here, for example, than there are if you're trying to build nuclear power plants in Korea. There's a whole steady accretion of rules and regulations across different areas that have got us to this point, and that is going to be the only way through, is going to be cutting away some of that red tape.
There's quite a large number that are very pro these reforms, but there's a significant number that are worried that it's going too far. And that is the tensions, but it's sort of thematically played out on a number of issues, isn't it, between the leadership. We still saw it probably when we were in number 10 too, but between the leadership and the backbench that feel they're not sure what the soul of this party is.
It is, although I was at an event with Labour Growth Group MPs on Monday, huge room, packed room, and I think they recognise, not least given where the polls are now, that this government has to deliver. They have to be the proof of they've had all this positive rhetoric about building, and we've said we're going to make it easy to get on the housing ladder, and they have to have, come 2029, actually delivered that stuff.
Will this help the bills pledge that Miliband made, the £300 cheaper?
The source of our high energy bills is our reliance on expensive gas, and we need to build more of our own clean energy sources to get off gas. So yes, in the long run, in the short run, he is ultimately at the mercy of international gas markets.
If you look at holistically the spending review, there's loads of also heavily debated taxes, right? It's rules around gifting, inheritance tax, that could be in the crosshairs. The option of freezing income tax thresholds is also something that could possibly change. So I know that through the lens, Sam, of infrastructure, is this going to be the focal point? Or if at the end of the day, this is a holistic choice of whether you are fairer for the Brits at large, does infrastructure come in as a second or third priority?
Well, that's always been the challenge, right? And that happened in the 2010s. And it was one of the disastrous decisions then that we saw capital budgets, long-term capital budgets slashed in order to patch up. If you keep delaying that, if you keep putting that off, then fundamentally, you get to a point where, as we are now, you have these incredibly high energy costs, and you are reliant in some areas still on creaking Victorian infrastructure, which is not fit for a 21st century economy.
The reservoir point is so interesting. So last week they announced there'll be 9 new reservoirs by 2050, but 2 of them by 2030. And to your point about how they're reforming planning, that they're going to take the building of these 2 outside of the local authority planning process. Is that going to work?
Yeah, it's necessary because, I mean, you'll have seen the opposition to reservoir in Oxfordshire. And this is despite the fact that local MPs there, there's a particular MP, Leila Moran, who has campaigned to bring in many more refugees to Oxfordshire, and yet opposes the building of any new homes or reservoirs.
Which are needed for increased population. Yeah.
Because let's have it right. I mean, the need of reservoirs, without the levels of migration that we had, we wouldn't need more reservoirs. And yet you will have politicians who both at the same time say that we need to have massively increased levels of migration, and yet are unwilling to build the infrastructure needed to meet that demand.
Sam, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of In the City from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Allegra Stratton, and Francine Lacqua. It was produced by Summer Sardi, Moses Andam, and Tala Ahmadi. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer. Special thanks to Sam Richards. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts.